What is up, my dudes and dudettes? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm excited to share with you how I created this stunning epoxy resin table as an anniversary commemoration with my wife. We selected this beautiful piece of black walnut, paired it with some custom steel legs, and of course, incorporated epoxy resin for the river that beautifully connects everything together. Without further ado, let's jump right into it.
What did we pay for this again? Like 5, 4, or 3? 150. Nah, wasn't that cheap.
Step 1. Let's begin by cleaning that gorgeous piece of black walnut. This walnut cookie might not look like much in its current form, but it really comes to life later in the video. At this stage, we need to remove any potential soft spots in the wood with a pick and a flathead screwdriver. Then it's important to remove any bark from the live edge. We don't want the bark hiding the beauty of the wood underneath. I also hit all the live edge with the wire wheel to clean up the dirt and any remaining stubborn pieces of bark. Now we're all set to proceed to the next step. Now it was time to plane the surface of the wood to ensure the top and bottom run true to each other and to reduce the thickness of the wood so we don't have to use as much resin. For this step, I constructed a makeshift router sled. I didn't own a router prior to this, so I scooped up this router for 20 bucks on Facebook Marketplace from an old guy who was moving to Italy. And the concept of a router sled is to create a flat track for the router to travel along so that you can achieve a near perfectly flat surface. This is a very tedious and time-consuming task, so I was glad to be done with it. For now, anyways. Now, on to the next step, which was splitting the wood. This part was pretty nerve-wracking, especially considering my wife was in the background telling me it wasn't going to work. So if it didn't go according to plan, then not only was the slab of wood at stake, but also my ego. But this was a necessary step in order to form the river that the epoxy was going to flow into. So I needed to divide the black walnut into 3 sections. The objective was to achieve 3 relatively sized and shaped pieces, and I also didn't want to cut the slab with a saw because that wouldn't look natural at all. So splitting it was the only option in my opinion. Luckily, it split according to plan, so now we can move on to a less stressful step. Alright, let's move on to constructing the mold. I used melamine to create a mold that would securely hold the wood and epoxy in place while the resin cures. Melamine is very versatile for building different molds to suit your project needs, but it can be a bit sticky, so I recommend using a mold release spray prior to pouring your resin. I did not do that on this project. I didn't use any mold release spray or tuck tape, so I had a hell of a time getting my table out of the mold. I also want to note that the mold can make or break your pour, so be sure to take your time, use lots of silicone, and be sure to make it 100% watertight. I ended up learning that the hard way on this project. I ended up having several active leaks throughout the entire pour process and lost a ton of resin along the way and created a huge mess. So I've since learned that it's a great idea to mix up just enough tabletop epoxy to do an 1/8 inch deep pour and allow that to cure for 4 to 8 hours prior to doing your deep pour. Tabletop epoxy is much thicker and cures much faster than deep pour epoxy, so it does a great job of plugging any potential leaks before you do your deep pour. Alright, so now that the mold is built, it's time to get it set up on a flat, level surface and place the wood into position. I laid out the pieces of wood where I wanted them and traced them out in place with a pencil so I know exactly where I want them to be placed. Once I was happy with the layout, I flipped each piece over and put a bead of silicone along the entire border edge of each river and around all the natural voids in the wood. I then flipped them back over into position and placed 10-pound weights on top of each piece to ensure all the silicone would hold up properly. Well, so I thought at least. I then began constructing a dam for the end of each riverbed. For this, I just used a piece of scrap cedar from an old fence plank and siliconed them into place. And now it was time to mix up some resin. Being a complete newbie at this, I had no idea if this was the correct epoxy or not, but I went with Total Boat Thick Set Clear Casting Epoxy, and it ended up working really well. So I was just trying to pour about 25% to maybe 1/3 of the entire pour on my first pour. I didn't calculate that out at all. I just mixed up a random small amount and got to pouring. And here goes my first pour, and I'm about to see an absolute disaster unfold before my very eyes. I didn't know what to do, so I frantically started building up silicone dams all around the areas where I saw resin coming out. And about a roll of paper towels and a tube of silicone later, I had leak number 1 stopped. I ended up battling active leaks the entire time, and for that reason, I didn't do this whole river in a single pour. I ended up breaking it up into 4 or 5 different pours, and I would just pour 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch at a time, and I would wait approximately 18 to 24 hours in between pours, and I would just basically make sure that the resin from the previous pour was still tacky. Then I would mix up more resin and do my next pour. I didn't feel confident doing it all in one shot because, as you can see here, there's resin everywhere. So I would just pour a little bit, see what happens, pray for the best. If it held up, 24 hours later, I'd do my next pour. Just kept repeating that process until the river was completely filled up. So now that the resin has sat in the mold for a full 2 weeks, it's time to try to remove it from the mold. And this proved to be extremely difficult. So I just cut some really long wedges out of 2x4s and just began beating them, driving them in between the mold and the piece of wood. Just kept repeating this process over and 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 over until I finally got it free from the mold. Now that the epoxy river is in place, it's time to level the surface. I employed a homemade router sled for this. It's a very economical method to achieve that perfect even plane on top of your table. Take your time with this step. Being precise here will yield great results later on. As you can see, I have since upgraded my homemade router sled setup from earlier in the video. I constructed this one out of 3/4 inch melamine, which is much sturdier and helps the router travel much flatter and smoother, giving me a more consistent surface. Next up, we're getting into sanding. And let me tell you, this is no quick step. Start with 80 grit, which is really rough, and it's going to help remove all the marks from the router. And then we slowly work our way up through the grits, moving all the way up to 600 grit. Now you can take this up as high as you'd like. You can go up to 800, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Just know that every step higher that you go with the grit, you're going to achieve more sheen and more gloss. So it's all about how much gloss you want out of your epoxy and your wood. I decided to stop at 600. It's a bit of a journey, but the goal is a super smooth finish. So we're taking our time to get it just right. Each step is crucial because every finer grit helps to smooth out the surface even more. So be sure to remove all sand marks from the previous grit before moving on to the next grit. Super important step. Don't rush it or you will regret it and you will be having to start over back at the lower grits. And as I go, I'm wiping the table down between each grit with a mix of water and alcohol. This keeps the dust under control and helps us maintain a clean surface free of pigtails. It might seem like a bit of a chore, but trust me, once you see the wood starting to shine, all the extra effort is completely worth it. You're not just smoothing the surface, you're revealing the true beauty of the grain, and it's honestly a pretty satisfying process to watch it all come together. So if you remember from earlier in the video, we created those dams at the end of the riverbeds. All I'm doing here is taking a Dremel and carving the epoxy back until it's flush with the live edge of the wood. Then once I had it carved back, I just sanded it just like everything else to just achieve a smoother, glossier finish on the end of the epoxy. So, like I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm a complete noob when it comes to epoxy wood projects, and this is actually the very first project I ever attempted. Now, I didn't know there were different types of epoxy, such as tabletop versus deep pour. Well, I did, but I didn't really understand their purpose, right? So, for this step, I mixed up some deep pour, the same Total Boat deep pour epoxy that I used for the river, is the same epoxy that I'm using here to seal the top of the wood. My thoughts behind this process was the epoxy was going to soak down into the wood, it was going to fill in all those little voids in the grain of the wood, and it was also going to help seal and protect the wood from damage, from scratches, from absorbing moisture and warping, all of those things. All right, you guys, let me know down in the comments what you think, but I think this is entirely way too glossy and it darkens up the wood too much for my preference. You can see it on the edges where I haven't put epoxy yet, how light it is. I kind of like that. It's better contrast with the orange epoxy river. I really don't like this thick, glossy, clear epoxy on top. Now, it is super uneven. That's because I was spreading it around everywhere, just trying to fill in all of these little voids. I got 90% of them filled in. There's a couple like there. There's a little tiny pinhole there, little one there. The little one there. I can fill those in with the black CA Bond super glue. No problem. So I'm not worried about it. But I want to use some Odie's oil to finish this instead of epoxy. So it's going back on the router sled. I'm going to skim all of this epoxy off the surface, get it back down to raw wood, sand it out one more time, and then just seal it with Odie's oil.
Same with the edges. I already epoxied the edge. Well, I haven't done the back side of the edge yet, but this front side edge that's facing out, I put clear epoxy all over it, and I just really do not like it. So I got to go around the whole edge with the Dremel, get that back down to raw wood, skim this on the router sled and sand it one more time, and seal with Odie's oil. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you like it like this, let me know. My wife likes it like this. I don't. I just know it'll look so much better with Odie's oil. So you'll get to see both. But you kind of lose the, like, I know it's not smooth right now because I didn't do a smooth pour, but you just can't really see all the beauty and texture and grain of the wood like this. It's so reflective. I'd rather something a little more satin. You can see the grain of the wood a little better. So back to the chopping board. All right, I'm not gonna make you guys sit here and watch me run it through the router sled again. So I've already done that step. As you can see, we're back down to bare wood. At this point, this table is starting to get a little thinner than I would like. So whatever steps I do from here forward, I'm just gonna have to live with it. All right, now let's take a break from all this sanding and talk about the custom legs that we built. I didn't just go out and buy legs like a normal person. Oh no, I went full on DIY and built these from scrap metal concrete form stakes I found lying around my property. Yep, I'm that person. You know, the one who can't throw anything away because it might be useful one day. These legs are gonna give the table that industrial, one-of-a-kind vibe, and I think we nailed it. So I began by laying out the design of what I was trying to achieve on our outdoor table, which my wife just loved that I did that. This was the only clean, flat work surface I could find, so I grabbed a tape, a Sharpie, a straight edge, and began laying out the legs. So once I was happy with the layout, I grabbed these old rusty concrete stakes and began transferring my layout to the metal so I could take them over to the only other flat surface I could find and begin cutting them. Now that I had all the pieces cut, it was as simple as bringing them back over to my layout table and just dropping the pieces into place and then tack welding them together. And my little guy wants to be just like his dad, so I gave him a shot at doing some tack welds, and he did a pretty awesome job. Plus, he loved seeing all the sparks flying, and he thought it was the coolest thing ever. Now that everything's tack welded, it's time to throw on all your PPE like your basketball shorts and your tennis shoes and start laying down some beads. Plan was to have these two W-shaped legs intersect at the center, so I had to take one of them and split it down the middle. Now I had the fun task of trying to freehand hold these up, get them all square, level, straight, and tacked together again so I could lay down some more beads. It was quite the struggle doing this by myself, and considering I don't really have any good clamps or anything like that, so I basically just, kind of floated it all in space. Got some tack welds on it, smacked it around with a hammer, threw a square on it, and I eventually got it to a point where I could live with it. Now, I wasn't too keen on the whole rusty look, so I went ahead and got some sanding flapper discs and just basically polished out the whole thing and took off as much rust as I could. I do plan on throwing a layer of paint on this here in the near future, so I really needed to knock that rust off to get the surface prepped for some paint. Alright, now we got all the rust knocked off and it's time to lay some paint down on these legs. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was gonna take my time and do a really nice paint job on these. I lay down a base coat and some clear coat, and I did want to get some finer grits of sandpaper and knock out a lot of the grind marks. I also wanted to go through and fill in all these holes on the concrete stakes, but this table dragged out for months at this point. And the legs, this table is going to be probably sitting in the corner somewhere with a couch up next to it. And you're likely not really going to pay too much attention to the legs, and they're not going to have that great of lighting on them. So I just grabbed the can of black gloss spray paint that I had lying around and just started laying down some paint with it. So I did my first coat, let it dry for a day, wiped it down again, and threw on a second coat and called it good. So a few days later, once the paint dried, it was time to figure out what the orientation of these legs were going to be on the bottom of the table. Once I got them clocked into position, I outlined the footprint of the mounting plate on the bottom of the table, and then took my router and routered these into place. So I grabbed my router and set the depth to match the depth of the feet on the legs, and started carving away some material to create a channel for the mounting brackets to rest into. Now, being that this is on the bottom of the table and no one's ever going to see it, I just did it freehand. But if you would like it to be a much neater cut, then you would just need to create some kind of jig or something to follow to get perfectly straight lines. Then I grabbed my dullest drill bits and began drilling holes in the mounting brackets on the legs. This only took about a full day. After a full day of drilling, I was finally ready to attach the legs to the bottom of the table. Now, for this step, I decided to go with threaded inserts. So I laid the legs on the bottom of the table so I could figure out where the holes needed to be drilled, and then began drilling my holes for the threaded inserts to go into. Before threading the threaded insert into the wood, I went ahead and applied a couple drops of wood glue to make sure that these never come loose. I am thrilled to finally be at this stage in the game. It's finally time to seal the table with Odie's oil. This stuff is like magic in a bottle. It enhances the wood's natural beauty, gives it a smooth, durable finish, and just makes everything look, well, perfect. I applied it in 2 thin coats, letting it soak in and dry before adding the next layer. It's like giving the table a nice spa treatment for its big debut. It might not look like much in this lighting, but wait until we buff this Odie's oil off and take it out in the sunlight. although we'll never see the bottom of this table, it's really important to seal it with Odie's oil just to make sure it doesn't dry out or suck up any extra moisture, which can cause some warping. And there you have it, folks, a one-of-a-kind epoxy resin table built with love, sweat, and a few minor, okay, maybe major, screw-ups along the way. But hey, that's what DIY is all about. If you enjoyed this project, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe for more, and leave a comment telling me what you think of this beauty. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I will catch you guys on the next one.